I should save the applause for later if you think I've deserved it or not. So being a distinguished scholar usually means that you're old. And I think that applies to me. Actually, when I stepped down as provost at Bentley University, I became the university distinguished professor. As my colleagues used to say, what they really mean, that's the university extinguished professor. But anyway, so let me tell you a little bit about Bentley. I went from the LSE, I was dean at Warwick Business School and then went to the LSE after I stepped down, and thought, as I did my PhD there, that I would probably retire from the LSE, being such a well-known and prestigious institution. But I got the opportunity to go to Boston in the United States as provost, essentially the chief academic officer there, to develop a business university. And that really piqued my interest. My elevator speech on Bentley is something along the lines of, imagine a university within a business school. Yeah, not a business school within a university, but the other way around. So something like 40% of the faculty are in the arts and sciences, but teaching business students. So philosophers teaching business ethics, real mathematicians teaching doctoral students about quantitative methods, rather than someone like me that's forgotten all the statistics he ever learned a million years ago, and so on. So that really was interesting to me, and I spent 12 years there. I'm now back in this country. I'm retiring from Bentley, and so I have this fractional appointment at Loughborough, where my role is to help doctoral students and early career members of faculty to get their work published. Yes, so this I wanted you to read this paper of mine, and I hope you've read it. Did they tell you about the exam? And I wanted you to read it beforehand. I mean, it's ancient, right? It's 1991 that this was published. So what relevance does it have now? Things have changed, just a little bit, since 1991. But to my surprise, this was a paper that I had published in the proceedings of an IFIP 8.2 conference that was held around that time. And it's been cited, I don't know, it's approaching 1,000 or so times and is still being referred to. So what's that about? And I thought it might be a useful means for us to get discussions going this morning in relation to doing research in this field. Now, my apologies for those of you who are more on the computer science, software engineering side of things. My interests, as you might expect from being the Journal of Strategic Information Systems, are more related to the role of information technology within and between organisations and indeed in wider society. So I'm much more focusing on the managerial, organisational change, strategic issues associated with information technology. So forgive me for that, because this is the orientation or the basis from which I'm approaching this paper. And essentially it's about thinking about what research approaches we might undertake in doing the research that we are interested in. I think it's going to apply to those of you more on the technical side of things, but that's for you to judge. If it doesn't apply, my apologies, so you can hold the applause, but I think it might. And I was asked to do a keynote, and so I had this crazy idea. Well, a keynote, in a doctoral consortium doesn't sound quite right to me. So if you can imagine, in the same way that I'm confusing universities and business schools, I thought I would confuse a keynote with a discussion and a workshop. So we are all doing this keynote. So you can leave now if you're getting a little bit anxious about this. Because I want you halfway through this to begin to reflect on this paper in relation to the work that you are doing. I'm just looking around the room now to see how many people there are. 1, 2, 3, 4. We'll probably have enough for about 3 or 4 groups, and I'll, at that stage during this session, I'll ask you just informally to start talking amongst yourselves for 10 minutes or so, 10, 15 minutes, because we've got probably about an hour to reflect on how you might use the kind of ideas that are in this paper in the work that you are doing. And I hope that that's going to work for you all. So I want you to be setting the agenda for the second half of the session this morning. Okay. So Bentley, as I said, is a business university. It's just outside of Boston. It's a private university, about 5,500 students, all doing business, either at undergraduate, specialist, master's, MBA, or doctoral levels, paying a lot of money to go and study there. But we're quite successful in terms of our students, our graduates getting jobs. Actually, we're top in the state of of Massachusetts in the USA. So 96% of our graduates have jobs within 3 months of graduating. Harvard only gets 95. So we're quite proud of that. So it's a very strong tradition in accounting and finance, but also in information systems. So some of my colleagues there include people like Lynn Marcus, for example, who is very well known in the information systems field. And my role at Loughborough, as I said, was to help in terms of getting things published. And you might want to talk about that aspect of our work if you're interested. Okay, let's go on. So, reflections on research methods in information systems. Why do I think that this is an important topic? It's quite often I've examined indeed in software engineering and in information systems, management information systems, information management, something close to 100 PhDs examined as an external examiner. And it's most often I see that there might be quite a good discussion about the research design that's being adopted. But quite often, I don't see a reflection on alternative approaches that might have been used in undertaking a particular piece of research. Why is this approach being adopted? Might the results of the research be somewhat different if we had approached this topic in a different way? Is there a bias associated with a particular research method or research approach? Are we missing something? The answer is yes. But whatever we do, we've set the boundaries somewhere or other, and we've probably given certain variables the value 0, which would be the one value that that variable doesn't have. So by setting and focusing in terms of what we're doing and what we're measuring, however we measure it, qualitative or quantitative, we have done something to the phenomenon or the topic of study that might need to be reflected upon in a different way had we looked at this phenomenon in a different way. So this is what this is about. It's about why am I approaching my research in the way that I am? Why have I chosen this particular approach? What alternatives might we have adopted? And what impact might those different approaches have had on our findings and our conclusions? And then what does that mean in terms of the utility of the research approach we've adopted? Because in undertaking a PhD or writing a paper for a journal, the examiners or the reviewers will be wanting to see what your contributions are, not in terms of just the findings from the empirical study, but also what your reflections and contributions are in terms of the utility of the theories that you're adopting, or the research method that you've adopted. Might you have some things to say about the utility of the research method, which might be themselves a contribution? And so it's with this in mind that I thought that this might be a useful start to this morning's discussion. So it's an opportunity to focus on this paper that I produced all those years ago. But as I've said, it's an opportunity too to reflect on what might need to change in terms of the analysis that's written up in that paper. Things have changed radically in terms of our technologies since that time. When you're my age, when you begin to reflect on what we understand to be information technology, it's really quite remarkable. My supervisor at the LSE is a guy called Frank Land. Frank worked in the 1950s on the Leo computer. Does anyone know what the Leo computer is, or was? I thought people were in the room. Oh, there you are there. Oh. I thought the PhD students were quite vociferous and liked to talk about their work. No one knows what the Leo computer is. Shame on you. Look it up. It's not about a lion, although it is about lions. The first business application of computing came about in 1951, and LEO stands for Lions Electronic Office. And this thing was massive, probably filled up this room and more, held together by bits of string and all kinds of valves and stuff. But Lions used to have coffee shops, tea shops, and small restaurants, sandwiches, soup and so on. And they needed to forecast what sort of supplies they might, if it's a hot day, let's bring in some more ice cream. Cold day, let's have some more soup. And this was the first application of computing in the world of business. And the Association for Information Systems, the Worldwide Academy for Information Systems, awards the Leo Award for lifetime contributions to the field of information systems. And it's named after that first application of business computing. Much to the chagrin of the Americans, actually, because they'd like to think that they were number one in terms of producing business computing. but it's actually recognised by the Guinness World Records, Book of World Records. So I think they probably know what they're talking about. Okay, so it's an opportunity to reflect on the framework and the contents of that paper on given the changes that have taken place in the intervening, 25 years, quarter of a century. The way that we look at the topics that we study, the kind of topics we study. If you were in this department in the 1980s, your PhD would probably be about a systems development methodology of some kind, about developing applications. Our interests are much more different than they were back then. So what's the utility of this paper in this very changed context? What about the wider impacts of information technology on society, on the way, on ethics, the ethics of doing research, the ethics of the impact of information technology on people's lives, security, privacy, all those kinds of issues. These were probably things that weren't talked about so much back then. So I just want you to think in terms of your interests, how useful this work is. As I said, it's your agenda, not mine. Just to remind you, the paper reflects on the more positivist approaches versus the more interpretivist approaches to doing information systems research. I'm now going to ask you a question, and it would be helpful if someone would reply to this question. Otherwise, I might actually pick on someone. What's the distinction between positivist approaches and interpretivist approaches, in your view? Yes?
The way they look at the world.
Yeah?
Positivists, they have positivists, they look at world with an objective mind, while interpretivists believe in multiple realities. They don't believe that there is only one way of looking at the world.
Yeah, good. That's very good.
I think it's about the outcome. For the positives, I think the outcome is more practical. For the interpretives, I think it's more abstract outcome. It all comes because I saw the action research. It's more about the design theory, utility theory, kernel theory, and how much or how the level of abstraction of the outcome, whether it can be applied in different contexts or not. In context with the positives, because it's a certain case study or certain application context that you measure something, you measure outcome. That's from that case study, whether it can be applied to other contexts or not is questionable.
Yeah. So in my field, let's go. Yeah.
I think positivism is something about perceptions, views, while interpretivism is more about meanings and beliefs on a context or on a specific context.
Yeah. We often have the expression, don't we, is the glass half empty or half full?
Yeah.
The answer is yes, if it's half something. But the way that we look at it may be quite positive. It's half full, or it will be negative, or it's half empty. But they're both true. But so to understand where we're coming from, a person who was very much one of the founding mothers of information systems in this country, Enid Mumford, the late Enid Mumford from Manchester Business School, would be very much into socio-technical systems and worked with the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations after the Second World War. And she would often argue in a discussion like this that it's best for you to say who you are and how you are approaching a topic. Here are my biases. Now interpret what I'm saying about them based on who you know me to be. So much of her work was trying to create a better environment for people who were working with information technology. So back in the day, she would do did a lot of work with secretaries who would be working in offices and interacting with an emerging information technology of some kind, like a word processing system, which led to very different environment to the one that they'd been used to using a typewriter. So that's just an example. And the comment about case studies that was made. So in some respects, you could have a more positivist case study. These are the facts. There is no debate about them. That's the way that many case studies are actually portrayed. Or you could have more of a field study which is indicating very clearly what the different points of view being expressed are. And we could have a discussion about a case study about this department. And there are certain facts. You know, it's located in the St. John's building on Brunel University campus. There are X number of students in this department. There are X number of academic staff in this department. There are Y numbers of graduates, blah, blah. These are kind of facts. But I bet you if you spoke to the faculty, there would be different views about what the department is about or where it should be going and so on. So those are different interpretations. So going into an organisation, it's obviously important to reflect on those different interpretations that exist out there, as well as stating the facts. Another aspect of the positivist approach would normally be the development of hypotheses, which are then considered, and conclusions drawn whether that hypothesis has been confirmed or otherwise, usually using quantitative measures and analytics of some kind. Whereas it's more often the case that you would have research questions in an interpretivist approach. So that's the first thing in this paper, was to try to discuss some common and not so common approaches being adopted in the field at that time, and make the distinction between the positivist and the interpretivist. That wasn't very clear at the time, I have to tell you. It was kind of in the background of people's minds. This is the way that I do things. If you look at MIS Quarterly, back in the day, there's a quite a famous paper. MIS Quarterly is published from the MIS Research Center at the University of Minnesota in the States. And back in the day, Minnesota was known for its use of laboratory experimentation. People coming up with hypotheses about, most commonly in those days, decision support systems. And they'd often use students as surrogates for executives to reflect on the use of different decision support systems. And they would create some hypotheses and test them and draw some conclusions. And this paper in MIS Quarterly, I think it's called something about the Minnesota experiments. And that was the approach that they would adopt. You went to do a PhD at University of Minnesota, you would do laboratory experimentation. That's what we did. That's our approach, almost irrespective of the topic being studied. But I was reflecting on this and thinking, well, that would be very good for the PhD students concerned in terms of honing their skills using a particular positivist approach to undertaking information systems. But what if we were looking at, I don't know, the digital divide, the use of information technology in developing countries, the haves and the have-nots in terms of access to computing, some sort of societal issue. I'm not so certain that a laboratory experiment would be so relevant in that context. So while they were honing particular skills there, they were perhaps also at the same time, without thinking, restricting their focus on what the field of information systems was about, because they were only undertaking research that could be dealt with utilising this approach. In this country, you found, and in Scandinavia, you found many more people, including people that used to be working in this department, like Guy Fitzgerald, undertaking action research in organisations, trying to improve the use of information technology for a particular purpose, and actually getting involved in improving the situation. And that was something which was kind of unheard of the other side of the Atlantic. It wasn't real research. So these were kind of issues that were being not reflected on at the time, and in my view, they needed to be. But what of critical thinking? There's an article that came out around the same time by von der Olekowski and Jack Baroudi, which is worth looking at, I think in MIS Quarterly, which talks about critical approaches. In other words, thinking more critically about the impact of information technology, the unintended consequences of information technology on people's lives and so on. And I mentioned before things like ethics and so on. The ethics of being, we're all walking around with our own data on us, you know? I've got a Fitbit on here. Someone somewhere is probably figuring out how fit I am as we speak. But this is my data. I don't want someone telling me, I've got a sat-nav in my car. Well, someone can be knowing where I'm going. What about the ethics associated with that? All kinds of stuff. All right. So basically, this paper boils down to looking at some of those different approaches that I listed earlier, and then saying, well, let's also think about what it is we're studying, and then how we're going to go about studying it. And so our object of study could be bigger societal issues. They could be about information technology within organisations or within groups within organisations or between organisations. They could be about individual use of technology, HCI, etc. They could be about a particular technology themselves or a particular methodology which is being adopted. And where are we in the process of developing theory? Are we beginning to build theory, test it, or extend it in some way? These are all considerations that need to be taken into account. I saw someone taking a picture of this slide. There will be a copy of all of these slides available for everyone afterwards if you're interested. And what did I do? Very scientifically, I scratched my head and said, with approach X, well, it's one of these two, and if I'm dealing with something about society, yeah, that seems pretty relevant. or no, that seems pretty irrelevant, or I don't know, so I'll put maybe down there. Very scientific approach it was. But it was, the idea about this was not to be, but just to make you think. You know, would it work? Oh yeah, that could work. Oh, I hadn't thought about that. I'm doing it this way, but there are these alternatives there. And when I come to write up my dissertation, I probably need to say why it is I've taken up that approach, what the alternatives could have been, and when I reflect on my results, maybe things might have been different had I undertaken this other approach. And then when it came to you know, where to from here is a kind of a section in your dissertation at the end. What else needs to be done? Well, we might want to apply this approach to this field of interest, because it hasn't been done before. Another thing I should just mention before I go on is when you do your literature review, the worst literature reviews are those which say X says this, Y says this, Z says this. The person examining you probably knows that X says this, Y says this, and Z says this. But if you can set out, maybe in tabular form, the major pieces of work which have been undertaken, and the conclusions, and the way that they went about finding those conclusions, the approaches adopted, that in itself might be a contribution that your thesis can provide. And you can claim that during the examination. And so, oh yeah, that's kind of synthesizing the field rather than just describing it, what's gone on before. And you might find, not only in doing that analysis, you might not only say, well, there seems to be a debate here which we need to try to resolve, and that's a reason for doing this research, or there are some gaps here that they haven't considered this, or they haven't considered that, and that's why I'm doing this research. But you might also be thinking in terms of the questions of research method. So, an argument you can use is look at this topic that I'm interested in, and there's been 10 years of research on this topic, and 99% of the time this approach has been adopted in doing this research. So I'm going to continue that decision, that tradition, and undertake my research this way. Or here are all these alternatives that we could have adopted, and I'm going to approach it this way because I'm a revolutionary and I want to try things differently to see how we're getting on. So it's up to you how you use those data, but at least it's demonstrating to the examiner, and indeed if you're writing up for a journal publication, it's at least demonstrating to the editor or to the examiner that you've reflected on your method. Question, you look up any journal in the field of information systems and look at a paper that you're interested in and keywords. I would pose the question, how many times do you see the research method mentioned in the keywords? The answer is rarely. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that's a shame. I think it's missing something, because it's kind of not thought about as much as it should be. Okay. This question of theory extension. When Frank and I wrote an earlier paper for Communications of the ACM, which at the time was probably the leading theoretical research journal in the field of information systems, now much more practically oriented because of change in editorship and an approach being adopted there. But in those days, it was kind of like an information systems research. It predated it, ISR. And we wrote a viewpoint article about this kind of thinking back in '87, I think it was. As it happens, my co-editor-in-chief at JSIS, Circa Yavanpar, from Minnesota, wrote a response. Something that she would wish she hadn't done now, I think. And she produced this. I mean, the useful thing about this critique of the paper, the viewpoint that we had written, was that she raised the question of theory development, theory testing, and theory extension. But she was saying, her argument was, experiments are at the hub of all that we do. And, you know, we might do some case study to get some idea about what's going on in organizations, which would lead to some research questions, which in turn could build some theory, which we then needed to test in the laboratory in order maybe then to go out to the field to do some further testing, which would lead to theory extension, and there'd be a feedback loop. And then we were invited to respond to her commentary on our paper, and we said, yeah, that's fine, but you could approach it in a different way. You could start with a research question arising from a literature review, for example. And you might want to do some survey research to get a general understanding of what's going on. In my PhD, I did some work on what approaches to information systems planning were being undertaken in this country, and because I was based in Australia at the time, I compared the two countries because there hadn't been any empirical work done in terms of approaches to planning for information systems in either country at that stage. There had been some work done in the States, but not here. So, but from doing a survey, we might then build some theory, which we could then apply to some action research or a case study, which we could then test and then develop further theory as a result of that. So we were showing that there are different approaches to theory building, testing and extension to the one that she had suggested.
So in this case, we have multiple views of approaching it.
Yep. And those are just two. You could think up others. That's what we were saying. So, in the paper that was sent out, I think you got these kind of questions.
We have some at the back.
And there's some at the back as well. So here are some indicative questions that I wanted you to think about. How relevant is that distinction between the positivist and the interpretivist approaches, given that there's talk of critical approaches now and the ethical considerations that I mentioned before. Major IS journals require a contribution to theory. Yeah, but information systems is an applied field. There's a lot of debate about how practical our work should be or is in terms, you know, how many people who are practitioners read MIS quarterly or information systems research. Nice round number, I think. So, yeah, what about those issues? What about this issue of theory, alternative routes to theory extension? etc. So those are just some indicative questions that you might want to reflect on yourself having read this paper. But then there are other issues about the very nature of the data that are available to us now. So for example, the vast quantities of data out there in terms of what is colloquially called big data and so on. Those might be issues that we need to reflect on, given the fact that this was written way before these technologies were available to us. But as I said at the very beginning, it's most important that you pose and discuss questions that are important to you in the context of the work that you're doing. So what I'd like you to do is to split, there's a few more people in the room now, let's say split into 4 or so groups we can go on to about 1:15. For say 10 minutes, and just reflect on the paper, maybe reflect on 1 or 2 of those discussion topics that I've posed, or maybe you will have alternative questions, things that you want to discuss, just between you. Pick one person to provide a very brief 1 or 2 minute feedback to the group as a whole, so that you can give us all the benefit of your brief discussions. So this is a start of a discussion which I'd like you to have as a community in terms of the research you're doing. And over coffee, over lunch, not just today, but over the next few days, you might want to just think about and have other people question what it is you're doing. I know when I was a PhD student, I was kind of scared about how useful my ideas were. I didn't want to share them. Not that I thought that someone was going to steal them, but because I wasn't certain about what I was doing. But don't be scared. You're in a safe community here. Well, relatively so. It is Uxbridge after all. So, talk amongst yourselves. As I say, for the 10 minutes here, now, but also talk about what it is you're doing and why you're doing it and how you're doing it when you have a chance, just informally over the next few weeks. That might help you in terms of forming your arguments and reflecting on the work that you're doing. Okay? So let's have kind of like one little group here and another one there and another one here. Okay? You form your own book groups. 10 minutes, it's now 6 minutes to, so I make that 4 minutes past. Right. What were your reflections?
Our reflection is on the first question.
On the first question?
Yeah, regarding the distinction you have between scientific and interpretive approach.
Yes.
We look at your classification on case studies and what you have written earlier on regarding field studies. And we said it's a matter of semantic. Yeah, the field studies.
Yes.
Because if you look at case studies and field studies, it all depends on someone's research question and his philosophical assumptions. Because as you mentioned earlier, that if you are taking this department as a case study, and it is a fact that it is located in Uxbridge in Brunel, then in St. John Building, that is the scope you are taking as a case study.
Yes.
But probably when you go to the field, interpretation of people's interpretation, as Walsham has said, might be different.
Yes.
The way people will look at issues will differ. So we look at it that way. Case studies might be scientific and can also be the other way around. So we feel like the names is just a matter of semantic, and it can belong to each group you have.
Okay. So is it just a question of semantics? I thought there were people in this room.
We had this discussion, and we believe that like there is either like the actual contribution that you believe you're going to have like a good quality in your contribution that's going to define which approach you're going to take, or it is like the problem by itself which is going to define. So we have like the ends and the front of the problem by itself. So that would be like a question by itself. It's not an answer. Which of them do you have to get as like a trigger for you to generate your ideas around your approach?
I mean, the approach that I would take in terms of the question or the comment that was raised, let's say in your particular topic area, a case study had been described in a paper that you found interesting. Let's say even that they, in the key words, they'd said, I'm using a case study approach. What I'd like you to do when you read such a paper, and we're just using case studies as an example here, what I would suggest is just a reflection as you read it. Is this written as a bunch of facts, as a kind of a positivist approach, or is it an interpretivist approach? So I would say it's something more than pure semantics. It just the idea would be for you to reflect on how the material is being presented. If you go to Harvard and do an MBA at Harvard, you will be presented with case study after case study after case study. And they will be presented as facts. And then you'll have a discussion about a particular case study, and often they'll have a chief executive from that company coming in to talk about the case. And then the question will be, what happened next? And those are facts. That's the way it's presented. Oh, your analysis was right or it was wrong because this happened. And again, you are getting one person's opinion, admittedly a pretty important person, a senior executive or even the chief executive, about what happened in terms of their standing in the market or their share price or whatever. But the way that there's little opportunity to understand the different stakeholder perspectives from the approach that they're adopting. Now, all I'm suggesting is just have, when you read the paper, whatever paper it is, whatever topic it is, just reflect on the research method being adopted. And the first kind of litmus test, as it were, would be to say, is this interpretivist or is it positivist? And particularly so in this kind of distinction that I've made there. Is it being presented in a positive style or positivist style or not? So I think it's a little bit more than simply semantics, or at least that's what I would argue. And the reason I'm arguing it is for you to understand better what it is you're reading, and then interpret the results as a result of your interpretation of what the paper is saying. What about this other group? You started to talk a bit about the earlier comment. What else did you talk about?
Yeah, we are a bit skeptical about this
Okay.
Because also there are some opinions that like you can base your studies in one of these two approaches and follow and continue with the other approach.
Yeah.
And you can support your argument as doing mixed methods. As your question here, what about like mixed approaches?
Good. Now, if you read Burrell and Morgan's well-known paper, they talk about paradigm incommensurability, that you're in this box or that box or this one. And then, but people like John Mingers have talked about pluralistic approaches, so mixed approaches. But again, to be aware that you are adopting a mixed approach and why it is that you're undertaking a mixed approach, provide the argument is what I would say is important. I'm not a believer of paradigm incommensurability. I think you can mix approaches, and presenting those different approaches, I think, gives you a more rounded, quotes, more accurate picture of what is actually going on.
Is there not a distinction to be made here between methods and paradigms, though?
Yeah, there is.
I mean,
And approach.
I can perfectly happily do an experimental study or a quantitative study within an interpretivist paradigm.
Yeah,
I think I probably do agree with the notion of the incommensurability
yeah,
of the paradigm. So either you see that there is a multiplicity of social meaning, or you don't.
yeah,
You can cherry pick your
Yeah.
methods to your heart's content.
Yeah.
But, I don't think you can have those two completely different epistemologies. A lot of people behave as if they did.
yes,
And actually that's one of the nice advantages of being in a design-related discipline like information systems or human-computer
Yeah.
interaction. You can just sort of pretend that social science debate doesn't exist.
Remember, I come from a business school, which are most often located in the social studies faculties, so we can't get away with it. But it is, look, I'm not certain there's an answer to this, but I think if you have answers along that way of reasoning, then you are going to satisfy the examiners. And you can even satisfy editors of journals, as long as you know what it is you're talking about. To forget about it may not work for a particular journal. It may, if it's a design kind of science journal, and we're applying design science. End of. But in other journals, which are with a more of an organisational, managerial, social scientific approach, then that may not be. So the question of paradigm incommensurability might come up. The reason why you're adopting a mixed approach might well come up. You give. I mean, one of the things as an editor I've come to realise. You know, I've been editing JSIS since inception. It's 25 years now, and I want to be excited about a paper that I see. So, you know, you might think topic X is the most important topic in the whole world, but kind of make sure that I know that. Why is this so important? It might be your burning desire to sort something out, but I might not share that. Your readers might not share that. So up front, give the reasons for doing this work, but then also give the reasons for approaching the work in a particular way. And then, you know, you've got a much better chance. You know, for JSIS, for example, we accept something like 7% of submissions. That clouds the actual situation. I can tell you that over 50% of submissions are desk rejected. Desk rejected. They don't even go out for review. Why? They're not good enough. Why? But other reasons. You know, it might be the best HCI paper that ever's been written. But what's strategic about it? You know, it might be strategic, but you've got to tell me it's strategic. It might be the best software engineering paper that's ever been written, but I've got to understand why it fits my journal, because we have a particular niche within this universe. And I need to be told, and the readers need to be told why this is so important. You know, define for me what is strategic. I'm not going to define for you what's strategic, but tell me what you believe to be strategic about this, and then we can go from there. So already, by doing that, you've improved your chances, you've doubled your chances of getting through, because you've got through that first barrier. And if you get through the first round, you've probably doubled your chances again. So increasingly, that's another thing, I'm sure supervisors have told you, if you get a revise and resubmit, start breaking out the champagne, start celebrating, because that's good. I remember my first journal submission, I got a revise and resubmit, and it wasn't accepted. And I was so down in the dumps, oh, it's not been accepted. No one told me this was a good thing. You know, you might have to go through in the top journals 3 or 4 or 5 rounds, and it gets so tiring in the end. But each time you get through a round of review, you've probably doubled your chances of acceptance. Probably, not always the case. Having just been rejected at MISQ in the 4th round. Shoot that editor. Anyway, obviously didn't understand what we were talking about. Probably we didn't either, that's another story. What about this group?
Sorry, before
Yeah.
we go to the other group,
Yep.
I'm interested in understanding your standpoint on the issue raised by Stavros Group.
Yeah.
That putting the two together, the mixed method approach. Because when you come up with this taxonomy, I'm not sure there is any place where we can put the two together.
Yeah.
So
That's
do you believe still there is no need for that?
No. I think it's an absolutely valid criticism of this work. We didn't talk about mixed methods in those days. You think that the first discussion about mixed methods in information systems really was from John Minger's work, for the most part. And that came much later. Much later. I mean, you will find in alternative when you see the framework itself, there are some where the distinction is blurred in the middle. That's as far as I got back then. But we weren't talking about pluralistic approaches or mixed methods. By the way, here's a story. That paper in Information Systems Research of John Minger's, it was rejected by Information Systems Journal, which was edited by Guy and David Avison. And then he went to Information Systems Research and got it published there. But that was rejected first. So when you get a reject, don't always think that's the end of it. Hopefully you've got some good feedback from the reviewers. All right, take that feedback on board, go somewhere else. And most people say, you know, we start with an A and then go down to a B level journal and so on. Well, arguably, John went up to ISR, arguably, although ISR hasn't got the same kind of impact factors as it used to have. But still, it's a good journal, obviously. Okay, yep.
Before you move forward, like another question, I heard you mentioning like design science approach. How would you like value that for IS, for information systems?
Look, it's not my style. There's a guy who's now retired from Lancaster. You've probably come across Peter Checkland's work, soft systems methodology. You heard of that stuff? Peter would talk about, when going into an organisation, he would talk about the problem situation. So it's, the French would use the term problématique, a nexus of interrelated, messy problems. We don't have a word in English for that, but in French, problématique. And he would say the problem situation is partly the problem content system, in other words, whatever is going on in the organisation, but also the problem solving system, which involves you as the problem solver, as the researcher. Now each of us have different sets of skills and capabilities and interests. So what works for me might not work for you, might not work for you, might not work for you. So we might approach things in a different way. There's no one answer, in my view. Remember, I talked about the yes, no's and maybes here. So when you think about the approach that you're going to adopt, be a little bit pragmatic as well in terms of what is going to work for you. Remember, you've got to get this PhD out of the way in, 3 years, 4 years? So we've got to go on.
Speaking of which, we're over time.
Yeah, okay.
You're enjoying yourself, but we probably need to start with the sessions.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought it was half past, but...
No, quarter past, really.
Oh, okay, so my apologies for going on. Let me, 2 seconds then just to finish. I'm sorry this group as well, we haven't had a chance to feedback, but I hope you had a good discussion. Just to finish up, here are a few more questions that I would like you to reflect on. Remember, you've got copies of these slides. This is not a sermon. There's no one way of doing things, in my view. It's what works best for you, as long as you've got a good argument for it. This book may be of interest in terms of your discussions. It's split between going from interactions between individuals and groups with the technology, almost from the HCI through to the societal. And we've chosen 3 or 4 different articles which have used different methods in each of those perspectives. And there are some discussion questions at the end. Those papers shouldn't be seen as being the best examples, because some of them are weaker and some of them are stronger. But they just give you an opportunity to debate this kind of thing. That's it. So, sorry for going over time. And I hope that was a little bit useful in terms of reflecting on the approaches that you're adopting.